everyone. Okay, story time. One time I shared with a good friend an event that happened to me. A true but rather strange, kind of weird experience. Well, when I confessed that this event was one of many similar events, she told me I should write them all down and put them in a book. Well, at the time, this just seemed too hard and time consuming. But now with so many making videos, and weird is not quite what it used to be, I decided to string together several of these amazing actual events and put them into one video. And I'll leave the weirdest one to the end. I'm sure that most of us have had strange occurrences in life that would be really hard to explain. So we've probably chosen to keep quiet about them so that we're not judged or called crazy. Well, since it's already probably a little too late for me to worry about that, I thought I would just go ahead and take the chance. The reason being to demonstrate that we are all watched over and protected by those in the unseen higher densities. Yet, as I said, most of us hesitate to talk about these incidents for fear of ridicule, or even as a result of our own self-doubt. It's easier to talk ourselves out of these supernatural experiences than to embrace them as the miracles they are. So my thought is to bring to light how within a, fairly typical lifetime, what may be easily dismissed by most as a coincidence is in truth a purposeful, life-saving, etheric intervention brought about by divine involvement. And, if one can identify these events for what they truly are, that they can be all the proof we would ever need of an angelic presence in all of our lives. Okay, so I made a list to remind me of a few of these weird events that I thought you might enjoy listening to. And, the first one, I remember this as a child, a small child, about maybe 3 or 4 years old. It seems like I was always sick with anything and everything that came along. And this time I was very ill. And the doctor had come to the house to examine me and ended up just giving me another shot of penicillin, his universal cure-all. I can't begin to tell you how many penicillin injections were imposed upon me as a child. I remember asking my mother why people get sick here. And I don't remember exactly what she said, but her answer just didn't seem to make any sense to me. Because to me, being sick was just stupid. It seemed like such a waste of time. Well, I remember at this particular time, all I felt like doing was sleeping. My mother laid me on the soft cushion of the window seat so I could look out at the sky. Well, the next thing I knew, I was floating up toward the ceiling, and I remember passing right through the roof and on up into a blue sky. Immediately, I felt completely well, and the higher I flew, the more blissful that feeling. The next thing I remember was being in a spacious room with white walls and lying on a table or a counter with 2 non-human beings hovering over me. Mostly what I remember about them was their soft aqua-colored eyes. The female put her hand over my tummy, my abdomen, and it felt warm and comforting. The other being began explaining telepathically that my stomach needed an infusion. Well, I was too young to know what that meant, but for some reason, it just seemed a lot better than another shot. So I just closed my eyes and sank into that kind of warm feeling. Well, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was waking up again on the window seat and feeling so much better that I wanted to get up. So I swung my legs over the side of the window seat and stood up. But because I hadn't been vertical for several days, I was dizzy and my legs felt like rubber. Well, my mom was sitting by the heater in a rocking chair, working on some papers. And when she saw me up, she was shocked. I told her I was feeling better and I was hungry. And she brought me a big glass of milk. Well, I was so thirsty and it was so cold and delicious that I just gulped it down. Well, instantly I threw it all back up and it splashed all over her chair. Well, I sat down on the rug while my mother cleaned it up. While I was sitting there, I heard a voice in my head. It was the same voice that I heard in the white room, reminding me that they had warned me not to eat or drink anything for 24 hours, or as they put it, 1 day and 1 night. Well, I had completely forgotten about that advice, and, well, obviously that was the result. But, one thing that sticks with me about that experience was how amazing food tasted after that. Okay. Oh, yeah. Another of this same sort of event that stands out to me was when I was around 12. During the summer, my dad would take us down to the river to swim on those hot days. There was one area along the river that was fairly sheltered, and the water collected into sort of a pool that began by a sloping graveled beach area and expanded out into the deeper water. Well, at that age, I was not a very good swimmer. Well, actually, I never have been. I just sort of dog paddled my way around the shallower water. And, I always wanted to swim under the water and open my eyes. My older sister could do that, and I thought it was so cool. Well, I tried a couple times without success. I tried another, I think it was about a third time, I was able to actually get under the water and see the bottom. Wow, I was so intrigued by what I was seeing that I didn't realize I had drifted out into the deeper water. When I did realize that, I just panicked and tried to get back up to the top, but I couldn't. Well, by the time my dad got to me, I was unconscious. What I most remember was being really warm and comfortable, and I thought I was home in my bed. I could see a bright light behind my eyes, and I kept hearing a voice calling my name. Well, I thought it must be my mom calling me to get up for school. Well, I felt like I was in a wonderful dream, and I didn't want to get up. When I tried to answer her, just attempted to talk, I started choking and gasping for breath. Then I could feel my body being roughly turned over onto my stomach, and someone was hitting me hard on my back. Well, I soon realized where I was again, and that it was my dad trying to revive me. Well, he was so relieved when I started coughing the water out of my lungs. afterwards, I remember his hands were shaking as he bundled me up in an old wool blanket. And I felt so bad for scaring him like that. Okay. Yeah, another experience that really impressed me, and it stayed with me all these years, was when I was in my 30s. One evening, I had been visiting my mom, and I left her house at about 11 p.m. As I was just about to pass the 24-hour restaurant at the edge of town, I suddenly and totally spontaneously, without thinking, jammed on the brakes and turned the car into the parking lot of the restaurant. It was as if the steering wheel had been taken out of my hands and someone else had turned in and parked the car. Then the most bizarre thing happened. I grabbed my purse and as if in some kind of trance, went into the restaurant, walked up to the counter, and asked for a large coffee to go. Well, I paid for the coffee and walked back out to the car. Well, before I opened the car door, I took the lid off of the coffee cup and poured it all out onto the pavement, and then got back into the car. Then it was like waking from a dream. I was shocked. I had no idea what had just happened. First off, I don't drink coffee, and I didn't drink coffee then, and had no reason to stop at the restaurant. I mean, why on earth would I pull in, stop, and take the time to go inside and buy a large coffee? And why a large coffee? Then come back out and pour it out onto the pavement. I just sat there for a few minutes, kind of gathering myself, trying to figure it all out. Well, soon I kind of got tired, so I started the car and steered back onto the highway. Well, as I drove, probably not more than maybe 10 minutes, I saw flashing lights ahead and realized there must have been an accident. Well, I was stopped by a police barricade, and I could see 3 mangled vehicles, one upside down, and the 2 others kind of welded together. And there were a couple people sitting on the ground and a few wandering aimlessly around. I could hear an ambulance in the distance, and I was able to find a policeman and ask what had happened. He told me, of course, that there had been a 3-car accident with 1 fatality. So I asked, when did this happen? And he said, just about 15 minutes ago. Instantly, my heart started racing, and I felt dizzy with the realization that if I had not stopped at that restaurant, I would have been one of those cars. Wow. And you know, this isn't the only time this sort of thing happened that ended up saving my life. Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm not sure if this one applies or not, but one night my son and I had driven over to a friend's house about 40 minutes away to watch the latest Star Trek movie. It was around probably midnight by the time we started driving back home, and had driven only about a mile or so when a strange, extremely thick fog bank appeared in front of us. At first I figured it'd be okay because I knew that route really well, so I just kind of putted along slowly. But the fog was so thick that really the only way we could even tell if we were on the pavement was to have my son drag his foot out of the door to check that when we hit gravel on the side of the road. It was crazy. I mean, I felt like we were suddenly in some sort of an alien world. Like, it was really eerie. Well, I can't tell you how much time went by because all of my focus was trying to stay on the road. But at some point, the fog began to clear, and by looking at the road signs, I realized we were on an entirely different road than the one we had started on. As I said, I knew the route really well. Well, I decided the only thing to do was to keep driving until I recognized a landmark. And finally, we got back on the right road. Well, the weird thing was, when we got home, my son looked at his watch, and nearly 3 hours had passed. Again, it's my feeling that either we had been somehow withdrawn from the car into an alternate, experience of some kind that had been blocked from memory, or we were detoured to keep us safe from a potential accident of some kind. I find it interesting how many of these incidents occur when my son and I are together. Well, another experience that, again, it has really stayed with me all these years. Late one night, my son and I were driving back home through a forested section of the Northwest. It was about 4 in the morning, and I was driving freeway speed while listening to a CD. And my son was dozing in the front seat beside me, when suddenly, directly ahead, was a huge male elk standing in the middle of the road right in front of my path. There was absolutely nothing I could do. I didn't have time to jam on the brakes or swerve or anything. I just held the wheel as tightly as I could, and I heard myself yell, "No!" I was sure we were dead. When my son heard me cry out, he jumped awake and grabbed the dash in front of him, and we both watched as the car drove right directly through the elk without a sound or a bump, just as if it was air. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the elk was still standing in the same exact spot, looking as if nothing had happened. I mean, that elk had to weigh about 700, 800 pounds or more, and we had just zipped directly through its physical body as if it were a hologram. Well, needless to say, my son stayed wide awake for the rest of that trip. Crazy. Another time that comes to mind. I was a young teenager and had a monster crush on a boy at school. He was 2 years older than me and a brother of one of my classmates. Well, I should have known better than to even entertain the possibility of being attractive to a boy, any boy. I was stick skinny and had buck teeth and red patches of eczema on my arms. I mean, it was pathetic. Oh, needless to say, not a pretty sight. And I was certainly not at all popular and would probably nowadays be called a geek. Well, for some stupid reason, I had gathered the courage to go up to this boy and ask him if he wanted to get a Coke after school. I remember my hands were sweating and my legs were shaking, and I was so terrified that I'm not even sure exactly what I ended up saying to him. But all I do remember clearly was his reaction. He started laughing and said something like, Sorry, but if you'd like to set me up with your sister, that would be great. Oh, I thought I would die. I whirled around and ran into the girls' bathroom and slid into one of the stalls and sat on the floor. Well, the next thing I was aware of was lying on a cot in the nurse's office, being told that I had passed out. Well, my mom came and picked me up and took me home. Years later, in a conversation with my mom about that day, she asked me if I remembered what had happened. Well, I said I remembered her coming and driving me home. Well, she informed me that when she got to the school, the nurse mentioned that she had been trying to wake me up, and I was pushing her away and saying that I was with the angels and I would not be coming home. Well, I actually don't remember saying that or what really happened. I just remember feeling very different about that boy, or even dating after that. But you know, the irony was that about 4 years later, that same boy called and asked me out. Well, I turned him down. I mean, hey, no way. But I will say that him later asking me out was a real boost to my confidence, which was greatly needed, to say the least. Well, another somewhat similar incident was when I was about 16 or 17. I worked at the local theater, and I didn't drive yet, so I would always walk to and from work. Well, on the weekends, the theater would have double features, so I would often be walking home around 1 or 2 in the morning. Well, one night I was walking through the college campus, and a car with 3 guys in it pulled up beside me and asked if I needed a ride. I politely told them no thanks and continued walking, but they kept following me and soon began hassling me to get in the car and driving right beside me. Well, I heard one of the guys say, "Cut her off." And as the car lunged toward me, the engine just died. Well, the driver kept trying to grind the starter, but it was totally dead. Well, I just took off running, dodging behind trees on campus, and finally made it home. You know, I have always been convinced that the car dying was some sort of divine intervention. And really, since then, I've never been afraid of walking out alone outside at night. Another, as a young woman, I had, as I said, I was always sick. I had double pneumonia twice and was hospitalized both times with really high fevers. Well, one night I was lying in my hospital bed, wide awake, just listening to all the sounds around me. There was the hissing of the oxygen and the ticking of the clock and beeping monitor, and I remember there was a man down the hall who coughed and moaned throughout the night, and it made me so anxious I wasn't able to sleep. I mean, the poor guy. Well, the way I remember this was that there was a moment when all of the sounds around me began fading away. It was like turning down the volume on a radio until it was completely silent. I felt so relaxed and peaceful. And just as the hospital sounds had faded, I now began hearing new sounds, like coming from a distance. It sounded like soft music, like wind chimes or some of the ambient music that I listen to now. I remember opening my eyes and seeing a white mist around me. I couldn't see anything else, but I was surprised to realize that I was standing. Little by little, the mist began to clear, and I could see that I was standing in a beautiful green meadow with wildflowers all around. And the meadow was lined with distant tall fir trees, and it was so beautiful. I remember looking up into the sky, and there were these beautiful blue birds flying above. And at that point, it registered to me that the musical sounds that I was hearing was coming from the singing birds. Well, I don't know, in what seemed like an eternity later, the scene began to dissolve in front of me, followed by that same mist, that white mist. And I could hear voices just a few feet away. Well, it was the doctor talking to my dad, and my dad was crying. Well, I had never heard my dad cry before. I remember almost word for word what the doctor was saying. He said, "We almost lost her last night. Her fever was up to 106, and we did all we could to bring it down, but it just wasn't working." Well, I had no idea that at all happened and that had been the case because I was out of there. Well, what I remember mostly about the next few moments was telling my dad all about what I had seen, the meadow and the birds, and all he said was, "No more of this, young lady. You scared the bejesus out of me." Well, that was the first time I ever heard that word, bejesus. But you know, since that experience in the meadow, I have had that same scene show up again several times in lucid dreams and during meditation. Okay. Yeah, very late one night, about 3 o'clock in the morning, my son had come to pick me up at the airport and drive me home after a very, what can I say, soul-stirring European vacation or trip. I had not expected that cheerful little planned holiday to become what it ended up to be, a sort of dark night of the soul, forcing me to gaze inward at all aspects of self through a deeply emotional interplay of my personal reactions to, how can I say this, to social interaction and circumstance. You know, it was strange. During that entire trip, it was like I couldn't get my bearings or a way to conform to the situation of being so far from home. I was so out of my element that I didn't know how to regain my equilibrium. And I felt lost in my own creation, my own erroneous conception, recognizing that I had done this to myself, unconsciously set myself up for a spiritual test that I wasn't expecting or even felt ready to face. I had taken myself out of everything familiar to my safe little world and entered a world of strangers. Even those faces of my traveling companions, who were my closest friends, took on a sort of unfamiliar feature. And I knew I was alone. And it was all on me. There was no one to blame. I did it to myself. I purposely left everything I loved and set out on, well, what turned out to be a sort of journey of self-discovery. it's a great illustration that when you're on a spiritual path and you're in position for the next lesson, it's going to show up whether you are ready for it or not. And this is what it became. That intended little cheerful, optimistic outing I had planned had ended up being an extremely revealing self-examination that knocked me to the ground and laid me out flat. And, my body rebelled as much as my spirit did. Frankly, I was constipated the entire time, and I hardly slept at all over those days and nights. Well, probably more than you wanted to know. But, before this, I always saw myself as a sort of a spiritual adventurer and really had no idea that I was that weak. And it disappointed me greatly. So when that trip ended, all I wanted was to go back home to my family and immerse myself back into that happy life that I had created for myself. When I saw my son at the airport, I was so happy to see him. I just broke down and cried and continued to cry most of the drive home. That drive home, the night was pitch black with heavy rain. And the back roads we were on had lots of twists and tight curves. And as we climbed in elevation and entered a deeply forested section of wilderness, with no houses for miles, we came around one of those tight bends in the road, and our headlights fell on a very large coyote, just standing there on the opposite side of the road, looking at us. Well, my son slowed the car to nearly a stop so we could take a good look at the coyote. And suddenly, I don't know, how do I even explain this? We were stunned and shocked to see that only a few feet away from the coyote was a girl, a young woman, sitting on the ground at the edge of the road. What? Yeah, we couldn't believe what we were seeing. Her hair was in a long, messy braid, and she was wearing a sort of a peasant dress with only a light kind of jacket over the top, and she was holding a blanket up over her head, to catch the rain. Yeah, and as we watched, the coyote kind of lowered his head and cautiously crept toward her until he was standing less than a foot away from her. Well, it was then that we realized these two were together. Now, if that wasn't weird enough, the oddest part was the look on her face as she stared straight at us and, kind of tilting her head to the side, smiled at us in the weirdest way. It wasn't a regular smile. It was very smug and mysterious. That kind of sideways smile when someone has a secret. It felt like she was sending us a message within that smile. Then she threw her head back and laughed. It was as if she were making fun of our state of shock. Here we were, 20 miles away from town in the middle of a mountain range. What were we seeing? We've all heard the native myths about coyote as the trickster, the shapeshifter. It was so bizarre. Who was she? And why was she sitting beside the road on a cold, rainy night with a large coyote beside her? What could it mean? Well, it was obvious she didn't need or desire any help. I mean, it was like she was in her element. And it was like she had the answer to some completely inexplicable knowledge or something. I mean, it's so hard to describe the depth of the scene in front of us. It felt as if we'd gone through a veil or something, some sort of portal. I mean, time had stopped and we were caught in the moment. I can still see it in my mind as if it just happened. And my son and I both agree on everything we saw. I remember we just looked at each other in total amazement. It was like an outlandish, perplexing dream of some kind. Well, in what seemed like several minutes later, when we had, kind of rolled a few feet ahead, we realized, well, maybe we should go back and see if the girl needed anything. Although I was pretty creeped out by then. But in the few moments it took to turn the car around, they had both totally disappeared. Or gone back into the woods or something. I mean, who knows? Who knows? We have discussed this vision so many times over the years. And we've never really heard another story quite like that. What we observed on that extraordinary dark night, I think the closest would be some of the UFO interactions. When someone is seeing something that's so far out of the ordinary that the mind just can't go there. Additionally, a very perplexing detail within this otherworldly event is that the moment after our interaction with the girl and her coyote, all of my misery and crying just stopped, and I felt cleansed. It was like the culmination of the entire spiritual journey. The phoenix rising up from the ashes, and I was free and whole. We may never know exactly what happened that night, but the significance is undeniable. The universe was speaking in a way that makes it impossible to ignore, and will forever be one of those mystical moments that proves that this world is not what it appears to be. And when circumstances are right and there are those ready to grow, the universe will bring forth the magic. So the next time you're held up or late for work or have a flat tire, stuck in traffic maybe, just realize that rather annoying moment, you may be in the hands of angels. That frustrating delay may just be saving your life. Well, there you go. And believe me, that's not the end of all these strange events in my life, but definitely enough for now. But hey, if any of you have had similar stories to share, I would love to hear them. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.